Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Really glad you could join us, and please submit all the questions that come to mind as we're talking about things. Um, so with that, this is what I'm going to talk about tonight. I really like to start with kind of what brings you here and kind of questions you have or things that you want to get resolved in our time together. And then I'm going to talk about some general things related to discipline to make everything you do more effective. And then we'll talk specifically about how to use timeout to meet kind of the goals that you have with your child. So this is the part where I want to know why you're here. So are there specific things that you're having trouble with using timeout, or do you want to just kind of know generally how it works? What do you think? Yes.
Getting a 3-year-old to go to timeout when they don't want to.
3-year-old, they tell you no. Okay. That is a great one. Any other things that you want to take home with you?
I got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. The 5-year-olds, I don't need to discipline very much, but the 3-year-old I do. And so just how I balance, he kind of holds me accountable to holding her accountable. So, if that makes sense.
Okay, so the 5-year-old is telling you when you need to put the other child in timeout. Okay.
I hear that.
Sounds good. Other things you want to talk about or other questions you have? Yes.
I've heard it's 1 minute per age, but then I've been to another seminar that said that it's until they stop fussing or crying. So, which one's better, I guess?
So 1 minute or fussing, crying. I think we're going to talk about that for sure. Other things? Anybody tried timeout and it didn't work? Yeah? Okay. What happened?
He just says no, doesn't want to go to timeout, refuses, throws a tantrum.
So you say timeout and then they say
Go to timeout,
not doing it.
complete tantrum.
Okay. Other people with that experience? Can't get the kids where they need to be?
Stay in timeout.
Keep getting out of timeout.
My 3-year-old doesn't seem to be bothered by it.
Okay, so it feels like they don't care.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
No care, not effective. And I don't know how this is working with the webinar. If you want to just belt out whatever you're getting on that, we could do that too. So does this seem like a good place to start with the things we talked about so far? Okay. So broadly speaking, how to make consequences more effective. So these are a lot of sort of general principles that you'll probably see in any kind of parenting presentation or books that you read about parenting or brochures or consultations with pediatricians, those kinds of things. But I just kind of like to go over the basics to make sure that we're all on the same page. All consequences for really everybody are most effective when they happen immediately. And so the closer in time and space you can get to the actual behavior you're either trying to encourage or discourage, the more effective it's going to be. And so I was just having this conversation in clinic today about kid misbehaves on Monday. If you take away privileges on the weekend, on the following weekend, there's going to be no connection whatsoever to what I did wrong. And so the more immediately you can apply that timeout, the more effective it's going to be, even across the course of the day. So kid is causing problems in the morning. If you wait until after school, it's going to be much, much less effective than being able to do that right away. And for busy parents, I imagine some of your houses are kind of like my house. It's really hard getting out of the house in the morning. And so it's really hard using these kinds of consequences in the morning when you're trying to get through the morning routine. But the more you can have some kind of consequence available to discourage behavior, and on the flip side, the more you can have sort of rewards or praise available to use to encourage positive behavior, it's all going to be more effective if it happens very, very soon after the behavior you're targeting. This is something that people sort of harp on all the time, being consistent. And, I talk to a lot of people, and I know that's really hard. We're at grandma's house, we're at the zoo, we're in all these different places. Being consistent with consequences is a really, really difficult situation. If you're not consistent with consequences, what kids learn is that they have to test, is this one of those places where I can get away with it, or is this not one of those places I can get away with it? It also makes the lesson that you're trying to teach with the consequence a whole lot less strong, because I'm not getting the consistent message when I bite my sister, I go to timeout. Or that when I listen to mom, she gets really excited. And so it creates a lot of confusion in the situation. One of the places this also comes up pretty often in the families that I work with is in transitions. And so like a child going from dad's house where he spent the weekend back to mom's house for the week, or spending the weekend at grandma's and coming back home, how soon do I get back into the routine of applying the consequences that we had before they went? Because they've had, I don't want to stereotype grandmas, but they're not always as strict maybe, and maybe not driven by routine as kids when they're living when they're with mom and dad. And so you might be worried about sort of dropping, what's the expression? Lowering the boom or dropping the hammer or coming down too hard. And the sooner you get back to kind of the expectations that you have most of the time, the easier it is going to be for the child to kind of get with the program. Because anytime you sort of let off on kind of where your expectations are at, it can potentially cause some confusion or anxiety, like, why am I getting away with this now when I don't usually? And so that means that maybe there are other times I can test it. And then the last one is contingent. And this one seems like the one I really have to harp on about to a lot of parents, because contingent means that you do the crime, you do the time. This is why I really recommend not spending a lot of time with threats, not a lot of time with second chances, not a lot of time with ultimatums, that you see the problem, you don't say, you do that again, you're going to go to timeout. They've already done what you're trying to correct, and so they need to have a consequence for that. You see this principle all over the place. If we all got speeding tickets driving to Lincoln on Saturdays, then people wouldn't speed on the way to Lincoln. Like if I knew that I had a speeding ticket coming my way every single time I went too fast, then people wouldn't do it. But because sometimes you get away with it and sometimes you don't, there's an incentive to, maybe I'll try it. Maybe I'll see if I can get away with it this time. So if you are following this principle, then there aren't a whole lot of explanations, and there aren't the second chances and those kinds of things. Make sense? Am I talking too fast or moving too fast? This is there's another parenting you that expands on some of these things, and so I may move kind of quickly through this. One of the things that parents often ask about this contingency one is, do I put them in timeout for a behavior we haven't talked about before? Like if it's something new, do they have to go to timeout without any kind of, or do they get a consequence without any sort of explanation or another chance? And the way I talk about it is it really depends. And so a great example might be, I threw a shoe at my brother and I went to timeout. I throw a baseball at my brother. Do I have to go to timeout this time? Well, of course. I mean, if you hurt someone, then of course you're going to timeout. If it's, say, a new situation where they haven't been before, or it's a new expectation that they haven't encountered, that you can teach it ahead of time and not necessarily use the timeout, but timeouts tend to be really instructive also, and so you can use this as a teaching tool also. So if they're in a new situation and they didn't know they were going to get a timeout for it, and you use a timeout, more than likely they're going to learn the really powerful lesson, I do this, I get a timeout. Maybe the most important thing about timeout is having what goes on the flip side, and that's time in. Time in, generally speaking, is every other moment that they're not in timeout, so that you're engaged with them and you're paying attention to your child and they're excited about spending time with you. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be hovering in every moment, that you're giving lots of praise and lots of excitement, but you also want to make sure that kids enjoy their time with you and making a really concerted effort that I'm paying attention to you, I'm listening to you, and I'm engaged with you. Otherwise, there's no contrast when timeout happens. If kids aren't getting any attention and they're feeling already kind of distance, and isolation from their caregiver, then timeout's not all that different, right? And so having this time in allows the child to understand that when I'm doing what I'm supposed to, things are really great. And when I'm misbehaving, then all these things that I get really excited about and really enjoy are not here anymore. So getting to the kind of meat of why we're here. So one of the things that often comes up is lots of concern about kind of the details and logistics and practical matters related to timeout, right? How long should it be? Where should we do it? Why should they go to timeout? How much should I talk about it? All those kinds of things, all of which are important to have in your mind and to think about ahead of time. But when it boils down to it, what we're trying to achieve with timeout is the state of mind, that it is timeout from any kind of positive attention or engagement with mom, dad, grandma, teacher, daycare provider, caregiver, whatever. So when timeout happens, I'm not getting any kind of attention. I'm not getting any kind of engagement. And that's not sort of broad enough that you say that, you know, whatever you do in timeout, I'm going to let you do, because sometimes kids figure out how to do dangerous things in timeout, and we'll talk about that. But what you're trying to achieve is no engagement whatsoever, that it's incredibly boring and mom and dad are not involved. One of my teachers in Indiana would talk about how he would do timeout in the car on road trips, that he would put his son or his daughter or his son and his daughter in timeout while they were driving places, and that they had sort of practiced this intervention enough that the kids knew what timeout was, and he and his wife could like shut down attention in the car and still go on with the trip. And so that's sort of like the highest belt of timeout, or you know, the ideal situation. Not all parents and not all kids are capable of that. I've actually never been able to make that happen in the car with my kids yet, but I'm still working for it. So what you're looking for is, I know what I've done has resulted in this separation and this lack of engagement with mom and dad or grandparents or whoever else involved. So when to use timeout? This varies by family. There are lots and lots of different reasons that people can use timeout. The major ones that I will talk to families about are repeated noncompliance. So I told you to do this, you didn't do it. I told you to do this, you didn't do it. You're not listening to dad, now you have a timeout. Same deal with aggression, so biting, kicking, punching, throwing things, that kind of stuff, and property destruction. However, if you've got a child who is engaging in other kind of problematic behaviors, you can use timeout for that too. That you don't want to overuse it necessarily, but if it's an effective intervention, you can use it sort of broadly for behaviors that you want to decrease. Any kind of dangerous behavior is another great one to use timeout for, and so running away or running off in public is a time I tend to recommend to families to use timeout. The how to use is really important too. And so one of the traps families will often fall into is, my child keeps getting out of timeout, what do I do? Or my child is in timeout and they keep arguing with me and I want to let them know why they're in timeout, and so I keep telling them why they're in timeout. And so what ultimately happens is timeout becomes this like really rich, engaging experience for the child, because you keep talking to them, and you keep telling them why they're in timeout, and you keep telling them, if you're not quiet, you don't get to get out of timeout. All of those things are going to make your timeouts a whole lot less effective because of the ways you're engaging the child, that you're giving them attention. It's not positive attention, but it is still an opportunity for the child to engage with you. And so it's not really timeout. It's just getting in an argument in a different place more than anything else. And so when your child is in timeout, you want to make sure you're in a place where you don't have to engage with them. And so they can yell and they can scream and they can kick the walls and they can jump up and down and they can lay flat on the floor and do all the things that drive you crazy, draw you in for getting your attention, but that it doesn't work. That when they're in timeout, that they're in that time and they're in that space, and that the only way they're going to get out of that time out is to comply with your expectations for timeout. And this gets at the question we had about, is it 1 minute per year of age, or is it when they're quiet? And I think I'll skip ahead and talk about duration now. This is one of those things that people can get caught up in pretty easily, like how long are they supposed to be there? And 1 minute per year of age is just fine as a guideline. For some kids, that might be too long. For other kids, it might be too short. And so you need to tailor it to what your child needs. If they go in for a 2-minute timeout and it doesn't seem to be very effective, it's okay if it's a little bit longer. For some kids, that making it 2 minutes is way too long. Like they can't keep it together for that amount of time, or they can't sit still for that amount of time. And so it doesn't have to be that high. Although that other part of the question is they don't come out of timeout until they're quiet. That is absolutely something that you want to stick with. And so timeout but rather than where it ends, it's where it begins. And so timeout doesn't start until you're in the timeout space and that you're relatively quiet in that timeout space. And so for some kids, timeout might be 45 minutes, but the timeout is really the 5 minutes at the end of 40 minutes of screaming. Does that make sense? And so it starts when you're quiet and lasts for as long as you have decided that timeout lasts. And I say relatively quiet because if there is talking to themselves, or if they're singing, or if there is kind of pouting about it, that's fine, I think, for a timeout. Yelling, screaming, cursing, all those kinds of things, timeout hasn't started. And so if it is really kind of oppositional behavior or defiant behavior while they're in the timeout, it doesn't start yet. Also, if I'm skipping ahead to the duration, use a timer. That's really valuable for timeout because some parents get busy with other things, and so the kid ends up being in timeout for way longer than you'd like him to be. For other parents, timeout is really, really excruciating, and so it feels like it's been 7 minutes and it's been 30 seconds that you want this thing to get over. And so some parents will pull kids out of timeout too quickly. Also related to this, it's important that kids understand that the timer doesn't let them out of timeout. The parent or caregiver lets them out of timeout. So microwave goes off, oven goes off, cell phone goes off, timer goes off, and the kid pops out of timeout thinking that it's over. It's not over. It's over when mom or dad comes over and says, timeout's over. You were in timeout for whatever the reason was that you went to timeout in the first place. That and the how to use part, that also is something that's really, really important. You don't want a lot of time and attention around timeout. So you go in a boring, simple way, and you come out of timeout in a boring, simple way. So, Johnny, you hit your sister, now you have a timeout. All you need to say. Sally, you're not following directions, now you have a timeout. And for even younger kids, you don't necessarily have to describe it with so many words. My wife and I have been foster parents, and we started using timeout with our 14-month-old because she loved to throw all of the food off of her high chair and not eat any of it. And so when she would do that, we would turn her high chair around to face the wall, and we had to do that 3 or 4 times. And it was over. She hated it. She would yell and scream and all those kinds of things, but she'd calm down a little bit and we'd turn her back around and she stopped throwing food all over the floor, which was really disappointing to the dogs. But we stopped having to feed her 7 or 8 full meals because it all ended up on the floor. And so we didn't use any words in that situation. We just allowed her to make that connection between I throw my food on the floor and I am in the situation I really don't like and facing the wall. And I mean, the timeout tended to last maybe 10 or 15 seconds, something like that. But we actually got to see the progression of it because she would go to push the food off her high chair and she'd look at us. And then she wouldn't do it and then she'd go back to eating. And there were even times where she didn't know we were in the room and she'd kind of look around and still not do it. Like she was able to kind of tie, this is my consequence, even if mom and dad aren't around watching me do it. So stick with it. And you can get the results. Coming out of timeout is just as simple and easy. So, what was it, Johnny? You were in timeout for hitting your sister. Timeout's over. Sometimes parents can get into this long, drawn-out conversation at the end of timeout saying, now, why were you in timeout? What are you going to do differently next time? And it creates this long, difficult conversation where there are things you want them to say and they're not saying it, and they're kind of meandering around, and it just becomes this whole big thing after timeout, and it gives your child a whole lot of control because they know why. Typically, they'll know why they're in timeout, and they are trying to like prolong or extend this interaction, and you don't have to do it. That you are in control of putting them in a timeout. You set the expectation of them going to timeout. Your consequence is concluded. Timeout's over. You're in timeout for throwing something. Timeout's over. You're in timeout for biting. And then you walk away. They might sit there and pout. They might argue with you about why they were in timeout. Some kids like to just sit there defiantly in timeout, that you can tell me the timeout's over and I'm not leaving. Okay. There's lots of fun stuff to do in your house. And if they want to sit there in the timeout space after you release them from timeout, okay. A lot of parents want kind of a reunion after timeout. It's almost always at the beginning just as stressful for a parent as it is for the child. And so like you want to swoop them up and give them a hug and let them know everything is all right. Absolutely do that, but wait until they do something positive. And so they get up out of timeout and start playing, or get up out of timeout and try and give you a hug. That would be okay. But you don't want that to come from you, that I want to console you after the consequence that you earned. That the distress related to this experience is yours. And if you don't like it, don't get back in the timeout. And it also separates any positive attention from the experience of the consequence. And so you were in timeout, you served your time, you come out of timeout, you want to do something that I really like, you sit down and you play with your sibling, or you come help me in the kitchen, or you just come talk to me. You can be really, really positive and engaged and excited. But this gets back to what we talked about at the beginning in terms of the contingency. You want to make sure that it's that sort of re-engagement is coming as a result of them doing something positive. So the location, what you're shooting for here is a place where you can monitor them, but is really boring. And so it might be sitting at the bottom of the steps. It might be sitting at the top of the steps. It might be in a corner of the kitchen. It might be sitting at the kitchen table if there's nothing there and they can just sit in the chair. Really, it depends on your space. It depends on what your home looks like and where timeout's going to work. I usually recommend to families to have 2 timeout spaces. You've got the primary timeout space and you've got a secondary timeout space. The secondary timeout space puts maybe a door between you and the child where you can stand maybe in the doorway and keep them in that space. Because if you've got a kid who's running out of timeout again and again and again and again, if you have like sort of a doorway, you can control where they are in that space better. I don't usually recommend a bedroom because you want the bedroom to be a positive, enjoyable kind of space. But if it's what you got, it's what you got. And if you need to put them in there and use that as a timeout space, then you want to like pull out fun things. And so that way you create a contrast that this is your timeout bedroom and this is your fun, enjoyable bedroom. So if you've got to use a bedroom, you can, but it's not what I would put at the top of the list. Okay? If you've got a kid who's constantly running out of timeout, as a general rule, if you have to put them back into timeout twice, the timeout space, your primary timeout space isn't working, and so you want to go to a room timeout. And that room timeout can be, guest bedroom, a bathroom can work as long as there aren't any hazardous or expensive chemicals or products for them to get into. They can't make too much of a mess. Some kids will tear the room apart when they're in timeout. Also just fine, as long as they're not hurting anybody or doing any expensive damage. Okay, at the end of that, timeout's over. You can come out of this room as soon as you've got it back into the order that it was in before you went in. And so again, timeout might last 45 minutes because you spent 5 minutes in your timeout, or 5 minutes tearing things apart, 5 minutes in your timeout quiet, meeting expectations, and then it takes another 35 minutes to put everything back where it was. All the books back on the shelf, or all the toys back in the basket, whatever they have to do to get it back to the way it was. Location can also be something to think about when you're in public. And so if you encounter lots of problem behavior when you're at the zoo or at the children's museum or at Walmart, I always love going to Walmart because I hear tantrums and all kinds of problems, and parents get so agitated all the time. And so it's really great to get that kind of natural observation of what's going wrong right there in the situation, kids knocking things off the shelves left and right. But even in public, you can do a timeout at the end of an aisle in the grocery store. You can do a timeout. I did a timeout with one of our kids at the, I don't know what they call it now, like the monkey or ape house at the zoo, and she was just sitting there on the bench screaming her lungs out. And so we had all these like zoo employees running over because they thought she was lost or she was hurt, and we had to wave them off and like, no, she just hit her brother, she's in timeout, she can sort this out. And so it can be a little bit embarrassing, but it's also really, really powerful to know no matter where I am, mom or dad or whomever's taking care of me is going to put me into timeout. If it is a space that really doesn't work for timeout, you can always do timeout in the car. That can also be really valuable too, because then you can be in the car seat. You don't want to walk away from your child in the car. You want to stay there close and make sure they're not too hot or they're not too cold, those kinds of things. So you want to stay close, but you also have to make sure you're not giving them any attention when they're in the car in that timeout. So location really depends, but there are really lots of options. We talked about this. The minute for every year of age is a fine guideline. If you're finding out for some reason it's too long or too short, you can modify it, use a timer, UN timeout. We talked about that. So is there anybody in here who hasn't tried timeout before? Okay. So everybody's tried this before and it's either worked or not worked, right? So if there's anything that I've talked about that's going to change your timeout procedure at home even slightly, this is how you might want to go about using any sort of new timeout knowledge at home and using this intervention or procedure at home. So sitting down and having a conversation with your child in a developmentally appropriate way. And so if it's a 2-year-old, it might be really, really limited in terms of how much you talk about it. But you do want to make sure they understand. You bite, you go to timeout. You hit, you go to timeout. You throw things, you go to timeout. Then practicing. Practicing is incredibly important. And so helping the child understand, we're just role-playing right now, or we're just practicing. This isn't a real timeout. But when I say you're in timeout, this is where you go. This is how long you stay. If you yell and scream, this is what's going to happen. If you sit quietly, this is going to happen. If you have a parenting partner who is also going to be using timeout, sometimes it's really instructive and helpful for you to put each other in timeout So mom puts dad in timeout, dad puts mom in timeout. You can show like what happens if the timeout is problematic. And so dad's yelling and screaming when he's in timeout, so he's going to have to stay there longer. Or mom does a really great job of going to timeout. She goes and she sits and she gets it done, and then she's out of timeout. So you can show your child both that this is how it's supposed to work, and this is what's going to happen if it doesn't go the way it's supposed to. And then once you go live with your timeout, then you don't have to do any more explanation. That it becomes really, really simple. That you did this, now you have a timeout, you serve the timeout, and you get the number of minutes of quiet, compliant time, and then timeout's over, you were in timeout for this reason. And then it's done. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of mistakes and a lot of new situations. I have worked with kids who are so good at drawing attention that they'll wet themselves in timeout, that they will, claw at the wall, kick the wall, do everything that they can to do damage while they're in timeout. If you've got one of those at home, it's probably a good idea to do timeout without shoes on. When it comes to kids making excuses in timeout, you might get, I have to go to the bathroom, I have to do this, I have to do that, asking lots of questions, how much longer do I have to be there? All of those kinds of things are behaviors that you can ignore while timeout's going on. Depending on your comfort level with cleanup and how much you believe it, you can decide that you can get a bathroom break from timeout, but that resets the clock. And so you can come out of timeout, you go to the bathroom, and you come back in. I personally don't use that. That if you need to go to the bathroom that bad, you better be quiet so you can get out of timeout and go use the bathroom. But lots and lots and lots of practice and lots of repetition and contrast. So I am having all this wonderful time with mom, with dad, with my siblings. I do something that I'm not supposed to do. I end up in timeout. That contrast that they experience there is what needs to happen in order for them to learn this lesson. There are lots of mistakes that happen, lots of frustrating things. You're trying to get out of the house. You feel like I should have done a timeout for that. I didn't do a timeout for that. You have the most control of a situation before you say a word. And so if it's 5 minutes before bedtime, if it's 10 minutes after bedtime, you can make the decision, I'm not going to intervene with this now. I am going to let this one go. Which is risky because it could encourage that behavior to occur more frequently, but it also is a time to do some real thought and planning about the intervention and looking at kind of the antecedents or what's going on before the behavior to figure out what you're going to do rather than focusing on the consequence of the behavior. And so if you're running into this problem that we get all kinds of terrible behavior 5 minutes after bedtime, maybe bedtime is too late. Or maybe the expectations around bedtime are just too much for a tired, dysregulated kid and a tired, dysregulated parent who also just wants to get to bed or has a million other things to do. And so kind of looking at the situation more broadly. But you can definitely call it. I know it's difficult to balance that with what I talked about in terms of consistency. And you don't want to take on more than you can handle, because one of the things that really undermines your role as a parent and the effectiveness of this intervention is if you start a timeout and stop the timeout because it's gone too long. So it's 10 minutes after bedtime, something happens that you feel like you need to use a timeout. You start a timeout 10 minutes after bedtime, that timeout lasts 40 or 50 minutes, and then you're an hour past bedtime and you just want all this to stop. And so timeout's over because I'm tired and you're tired and we're just going to call it. That puts you in a really dangerous situation because then the child doesn't understand why the timeout's happening or not happening, those kinds of things. And also along these lines this is a really difficult job. And parents get, I don't know, this is ballparking, 100 million opportunities to teach a lesson. And so if you miss, even a couple thousand, that's still doing pretty well. And so if you feel like you really screwed up today, or you really made a mistake in this interaction, or I really should have taught this lesson this way, you know, you can dwell on it if you want to, but that's not going to get you anywhere. If you realize kind of what happened and how you'd like to do things differently and can move on from it, it can be a really helpful and corrective experience for you, because then you're kind of learning from what happened and not beating yourself up about it. It's also really important, in order to be an effective parent, to be taking care of yourself. And so if you're feeling really overwhelmed at work and you're not sleeping and you're not spending any time whatsoever in any kind of enjoyable or kind of calming or relaxing activities yourself, it's going to be really, really hard to do many parenting tasks. And if you got a kid at home that can last through a 45-minute timeout, you better bring some of your own self-regulation to that situation, because that's going to wear anybody down, right? And so if you're going into that tired and stressed, it's going to be really hard to see things through. And so almost as important, if not as important, in taking care of your child is taking care of yourself. So I want to save some time at the end for questions and comments and conversation, and I always run too long, so I might come back to this one. I wanted to check with everybody here. There was a really interesting article in Time magazine recently, I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago, about timeout being ineffective or not good for kids. Anybody see that? Yeah? What do you remember about it?
I didn't read too much of it because it kind of works at our house.
Oh, okay. So you didn't believe it, so there's no reason to
I really
read
believe
it.
it.
Okay. Anybody else see this or have any concerns about it? Okay. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it if it wasn't an issue or didn't cause any kind of questions or consternation. But essentially, it was a psychiatry professor at a school in California saying that brain research shows that the experience of timeout is just like being isolated or abandoned, and that it causes more problems than it's worth, and that people shouldn't be using timeout, but rather they should be using time in. There were maybe a lot of problems with the logic of that article. Some of the big sort of psychological organizations have questioned the data about that. There's not any evidence that time in alone can correct behavior, but there's decades of research that shows time out can correct problem behavior. There were also some problems with the article in terms of the child. One of the points that they made is that children sit in timeout just stewing and blaming parents for putting them in timeout and don't really learn anything about changing their behavior. I don't know if that's necessarily true. It probably depends on the child, but I would argue that the goal of timeout is for a child to learn that they're responsible for their own behavior. And so I bit someone and I ended up in timeout, rather than mom or dad or teacher is responsible for my consequences. And so it makes a good argument for being consistent about it, because if mom and dad or whoever else is taking care of the child is not using timeout consistently, it might look like, well, dad does it sometimes, but not other times, so it really is up to dad and not about my behavior. If it happens consistently, then I know that when I hit someone, I'm going to get in trouble for this. And it's really predictable, and it's my fault. I did the crime, I'm doing the time. So some of these might look familiar. I'm going to maybe spend a minute or two on these, and then we can see if these work. So it sounds like audio, not visual, maybe? Okay, so these are examples of timeout gone awry. But I mean, it's probably a familiar situation that you see a child yelling and screaming when they're supposed to be in timeout, or arguing about going into timeout. There are a lot of those on here. And so we could talk about what to do about fixing that. As far as the questions people asked at the beginning. So 3-year-old telling you no doesn't make any difference.
It's hard to get them to go to timeout. Like, do you force them? Like, do you just put them there and then they run away? So that probably goes back to what you're saying about a room might be a good idea.
And you can also very gently hold them in the space.
Okay.
You don't want to ever compress their lungs or make it hard to breathe or squish them in any kind of way. And it's just fine to hold their shoulders or very gently hold them in some other kind of way, not bear hugs or anything like that. And while you're in there, if you do have to, especially with a 3-year-old, they're probably easy to manage physically. But as you're getting them into timeout and you're very gently holding them there, you want to be careful not to be talking to them or making this fun in any kind of way. Same deal with if you have to sort of physically guide them to timeout, you don't want to make running around your house to get them into timeout a game. And so you don't want to be yelling and screaming, threatening them with more consequences, that you want to make that process really boring too if you have to do it. 5-year-old can tell you whatever they want to tell you, and you're the parent. And you also don't have to justify yourself. Like the 5-year-old might get in trouble for things that the 3-year-old doesn't get in trouble for, and it's perfectly fine to have developmentally appropriate expectations, right? And so the 3-year-old probably doesn't have to clean up their messes in the same kind of way the 5-year-old does. And those are the breaks. They say no, they go to timeout anyway. We talked a little bit about duration. Keep getting up out of timeout. We talked about doing a room or doing kind of physical management. There was the question about feels like the child doesn't care or not affected at all by the timeout. I feel like it came from this side, and I don't remember exactly who asked the question. But if there is nothing different about the timeout that we talked about today from what you're already doing, we should talk more about it. So ask me if you watched this whole thing and heard me talk about all these things and you think to yourself, well, I'm doing all that stuff already and it's still not working. Whoever it was, ask me another question now. But if there are some things in here that are different, a lot of times the situations that I'll find where parents are concerned that their timeout is not working, they are really engaged with the child during timeout. And so arguments happen, or mom or dad keep saying that if you do that again, you're not going to get out of timeout, or they'll like walk over to the timer and while the child is in timeout and say, I'm adding minutes for that. All right, 1 more minute. All right, 1 more minute because you did that. No attention. And so you can add minutes to timeout, but you don't talk about that. That the child is in that state of mind or having the experience of timeout, it doesn't really make any difference if you're adding minutes or not. You know you're adding minutes, and the experience of adding those minutes is supposed to be aversive, and adding time will be likely aversive. And so they know that this is getting worse because I'm being so loud and non-compliant. So, what'd you think of this? Other questions as I've run through all of it? I know I went kind of fast. Yes.
I have a couple questions.
Okay.
Time out versus like taking something away as a different form of discipline, which is better? Which is more effective?
That's a really hard question because it depends on the kid.
Okay.
As kids get older, losing privileges tends to be much more effective than timeout, though it depends on the kid. Some kids I have used timeout with up to 10 years old, but there are some kids who it doesn't work past age 5. And so then you want to start having conversations about, well, you do this, then you lose Xbox for the night, or you do this, and you don't get to play outside with your friends, or that kind of thing. And so when it comes to individual families and individual kids, it's hard for me to know, not knowing the situation.
Would you say, because my daughter, she just
Turned 2. So at a younger age, do you think, like, stickers are her world? She loves her stickers. And as soon as she gets home, she gets stickers. She covers herself in stickers. So at times when she's being naughty, I'll say, no more stickers. But would a timeout be more effective, or is that still having the outcome that a timeout would, knowing that if she does this, if she does X, Y is going to happen?
Based on the details that you gave me, it sounds like, well, and this brings up a really good point too, that timeout should be part of a much larger kind of system of parenting. It's not a cure-all, that it's not going to solve every problem. And it sounds like in the situation that you described, stickers would work really, really well for encouraging positive behavior. And so she's sharing, she's taking turns, she's putting things away, she's following directions, she gets stickers. And when she is being naughty, then she would go to timeout.
Okay.
So you can use them both ways. One of the other things that is a limitation of timeout is that it doesn't teach new behavior. And so if you are discouraging behavior with a timeout, it can be really important, depending on what the behavior is, to encourage an alternative. And so if a child is hitting every time they want a toy, learning how to share, learning how to take turns, learning how to ask appropriately, that kind of thing. Other questions?
I have a question. My
Yes.
son has a lot of trouble like transitioning from like we get home from daycare and we go in the house, he throws a tantrum. Should I put him in timeout for that, or just? I mean, right now I just let him lay on the floor. So I guess it's kind of like timeout, but
It depends. You know, the question was, and I have to remember this for the online audience. The question was about giving timeout for tantrums. It depends on what happens during the tantrum.
he just runs around screaming. He doesn't do anything. He just kind of.
If that's breaking the rules of your house, you can use a timeout to address it.
Yeah.
If it is kind of annoying or grating, then letting it happen. What you can also do is encourage some kind of alternative behavior. If he's doing that because he's just got so much energy and he doesn't know what to do with it, you can give him something else to do. If it's happening because he's just tired and agitated after a long day, then maybe giving him a space where he can run around and that kind of thing could work. Or if he just needs some way to express himself, then you can have a conversation about it. I don't generally recommend a timeout for a tantrum unless the tantrum includes, you know, foul language or aggression or property destruction, those kinds of things. Using the timeout just for those problem behaviors. Did you have more questions? I didn't
I
mean to
just
move
had
on.
one more. Since my daughter's 2, she does some things that she deems to be cute. Like, I don't think she's being malicious. Like, for example, when I'm changing her diaper, sometimes she'll kick her legs, you know, and she's laughing while she's doing it. So I don't think she's meaning to kick me or do something along those lines. But I don't know how to distinguish, like, I don't want her to not think she can have fun, but I also don't want her kicking. So is that like something you would utilize timeout, or how would you handle that situation?
So she's on the changing table
Mm-hmm.
and she's kicking her legs
Mm-hmm.
and giggling and laughing about it.
Mm-hmm.
I bet when she was 10 months or 12 months, that was super cute.
Super cute.
And so she may have gotten the mess, like has kind of learned along the way that this is pretty fun, and I'm getting mom really excited, or whoever else is changing my diaper, like this is really fun, and you know, reinforced is what I'm saying. And so it might be difficult to make that transition, but don't feel like you can't. I wouldn't necessarily encourage timeout for it, because that could be really disorienting, like something that used to be really encouraged is no longer being encouraged. And so finding other things that she can do with her legs or with her arms, or singing songs or telling stories, or all different kinds of behaviors that might be equally enjoyable for both of you. Because, I mean, I know what it's like to change a diaper, and kicking the legs is about the most annoying thing that can happen, right? And so you don't want that to be going on. But maybe in more sort of gentle or subtle ways, finding other things that you want her to do, and not, I mean, that even sounds like something that you could ignore, that she thinks it's funny, but if mom is standing there very stoically while the legs are kicking, it sounds like she would learn that this is no fun. This isn't fun for both of us. And there are other things that I can do while I'm there that are fun.
A couple questions.
Sure.
One, is there an age? When is it too young to start timeout?
You know, I talked earlier about starting at 14 months. In that situation, the timeout would be literally 5 or 10 seconds. But you out there know your child better than anyone. And so if you feel like timeout is something that you want to try, I mean, obviously, like a 9-month-old is not going to get anything out of timeout. And kids have to have a certain degree of kind of self-regulatory skills, that they can learn how to calm themselves down to successfully get out of the timeout. And so I'm certainly not saying that every 14-month-old child is in a place where they can benefit from timeout. But there are kids who are that young who would. A lot of what I read about gives, 18 months to 2 years as a guideline. And so that might be a pretty good way to kind of judge it.
Thank you. And another question that came through the Mamaha chat. What advice do you have for parents who have different philosophies about discipline? One wants to use timeout more. The other one spanks. Timeout isn't working, probably because parents aren't on the same page. Is there any advice that you would give for how to help convince the other parent to try timeout as opposed to other discipline techniques?
Well, that tends to be so. Parents having different philosophies about what to use. It's difficult because it depends on why the parents are implementing different philosophies. And so this, unfortunately, will happen. I'm not going to use timeout because I'm super angry at mom and I don't want to do what mom's doing. And I'm going to spank because that's the way I grew up. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so if it's a parenting conflict that leads to that poor match of philosophy, that's a totally different issue and one that's going to be really hard for me to solve up here. The way I tend to have this conversation with families in session is that the person who's really who's suffering as a result of this is the child. And so if we're working together to find a solution to a particular behavior problem, then the more we're on the same page and the more we're doing the same thing, the better off it's going to be for the child. And so at least that might help start the conversation. If it's really kind of diametrically opposed and, dad's read all this stuff about spanking and how it's effective, I think he might have a hard time finding that research that shows spanking is effective. But we'll say that he did and that he's had this experience that I was spanked and I turned out great, and so this is what I'm going to do, and I think it works and it's effective, and mom is saying that I don't like that, and I've, been to all these parenting U talks and read all the research and read all these parenting books, and I'm going to do timeout, and you're really stuck in those two different places. Just because they're different interventions doesn't mean they both can't be effective. So you can get spanked at dads and timeout at moms, and if the timeout is effective and uses a lot of the principles that we talked about here, then it can be just as effective and possibly or probably even more effective than the spanking. Anybody from that side? I haven't heard from that side yet. Yes.
My boyfriend's family, he comes from a huge family. So my son has a lot of cousins, and they're not all disciplined the same. So when we are trying to work on something with our son, but then his 7 cousins come over and do everything that we said Hayden don't do, how do we continue to correct it? Because we'll put him in timeout, but then while he's in timeout, he'll see his 7 other cousins beating each other up. So he'll come out and do the same exact thing. So how do we in a situation like that, how do you find a line?
Finding the balance, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's an important thing to remember too, because there are 3 primary ways kids and really everybody else learns, and that's direct instruction, so 2 + 2 is 4, modeling, I do what I see, and through consequences. And so I do this, and I like what happens after I do this, and so I do it again. It sounds like that's going to be an uphill battle because he's getting these conflicting messages. He's learning from his cousins that you hit each other maybe, or you wrestle, or you fight, and the expectations at home are that I don't do that. How old?
Well, my son is 3.5, but he has cousins that age from 3 to 11. So it's just it's this huge gap where since they're all not disciplined and not all the same age, he's just
although it's more difficult, I wouldn't recommend modifying your expectations. The challenge might be to be really consistent about it and sort of being really quick to intervene and give the consequence. And this is potentially a good experience for Hayden because this happens at school all the time, that you see kids doing things at school that you would get in all kinds of trouble with at home. And so this kind of gives him the opportunity to learn that mom and dad have different expectations for my behavior. And even though I see people I really like or I look up to doing these things, I don't have to follow that example. And also maybe reviewing expectations ahead of time. I know he's only 3.5, and so you're not going to have a long drawn out conversation about this, but making sure he knows that all 7 of these cousins are coming over and they do these kinds of things. And even if you do what they're doing that they're doing these things in our house, if you do these things in our house, you're still going to go to timeout for it. And so there's no question and also that you're not in charge of managing or teaching the behaviors in the cousins, that you're responsible for Hayden. And so you're going to do the timeout or whatever consequences you have. On the flip side, setting it up to make sure that he knows that you're going to be super excited and super proud of him, and maybe even have all of these rewards available if he's able to spend time with these cousins and keep his hands to himself, or to use appropriate language, or whatever it is. So yeah, making sure both are there. You had a question.
I think looking around the room, I'm the only grandmother here, and I do want to support my daughter and her choices, and I use timeouts very effectively with all 3 of my children, and a strong-willed young man as well, and to this day he knows I mean what I say. But and it is different when your grandchildren come. You want to have quality, fun time. But at what age is, because what's okay at my house is probably not going to be okay at her house. And so at what age do they figure that out, and how closely, because I don't allow misbehaving by any means, she's 2 and I say, no, we don't do that, but I don't want, because I just think that our differences are going to be, I'm probably going to be allowing more things. Do we just need to try to get on the same page and I just need to know the big ones that she doesn't want her, to do, or is she going to figure that out pretty darn soon, what she can do wherever, I imagine?
Kids are really, really good at reading situations and what they can get away with. Even at that age, they'll be able to differentiate caregivers and contexts and those kinds of things. And I mean, people see this all the time with sometimes behavior at preschool is much better or much worse than what happens at home. Or mom gets home from work and everybody gets in line because mom doesn't mess around. But dad gets home from work and everybody's happy and excited, but we can get away with a whole lot more, right? And so kids are able to read those situations. He said she was 2, and that might be more difficult, but it sounds like you're doing a great job being explicit about it, that this is not something that happens at grandma's house. Well, and I imagine a lot of the core issues are going to be pretty consistent. That biting's not going to be okay at grandma's house, but at home you get in trouble for it, right? So there may be maybe the amount of candy that you get, or the amount of media time that you get, or how much time you spend on homework. I mean, 2 years old, that's not going to come up much, but it could. I mean, you're talking about how your rules and expectations are a little bit different, and it almost sounds like maybe more strict.
Well, I feel like I'm on the timeout because I'm here. Instead of being with her, so I can learn how to help her with her.
Okay.
But
after all this talk, I can't imagine that you're going to go home and let things fly.
well, no, and I don't. And I was the disciplinarian. My husband was the fun one.
Mm-hmm.
But it is different with the grandchildren. I'm here as a grandma, and I will tell you, a lot of things don't bother me.
Mm-hmm.
That bothered me with her.
Well,
So I don't want to, cause more problems for the kids, trying to raise her.
one of the most important principles that guides the parents that I like to talk to is being experimental about it. That we're going to try a bunch of different things, and some of it's going to work and some of it's not going to work. And really good parents are really responsive, and really good grandparents are really responsive. And so the 2-year-old starts having tantrums in the transition between grandma's house and mom's house. Okay, let's figure this out. How do we need to change expectations of the environment in a way that works for her? right?
Yeah, because I don't like her to throw her fit in dirty places. And not that you do, but we were outside.
Case in point.
We were outside and she was throwing a fit, but she wanted to do it in a pile of wet hay. And I didn't think that was a good plan. And so I let her throw her fit in my arms. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm here tonight.
I
Okay.
hope you're all laughing because you can feel my pain.
Well, and it sounds like it may have prompted a conversation between the two of you.
Well, I certainly, if she wants to throw a fit, you can throw a fit. I'll throw a fit. She'd like to build her a bubble so she doesn't get dirty or germy, and she's willing to overlook a lot more. I don't care. Throw a fit in wet hay. That's
Well,
maybe
I like the
next time
bubble
you
idea
won't
because especially
go
if
in
it's
wet hay.
soundproof, because then they can just go forever, right? I mean, this sounds like a difference in expectations. That it really, if you're okay with her being covered with wet hay and damp and dirty, and it might just be a natural consequence of the fit. What I heard in that story is you may want to be careful about picking her up because you don't want that to be interpreted as her, I can get grandma's attention or I can get grandma's affection by throwing myself in a pile of hay because that's only going to make it happen more, right? And so if that makes you uncomfortable, and there might be situations that are kind of unsanitary or dangerous where tantrums are happening, like if it's happening in the parking lot of Walmart, I don't recommend that you let the tantrum happen right there in the parking lot. It's just fine to pick them up and move them someplace cleaner or safer, and the tantrum can proceed in that cleaner and safer place.
And it pretty much stopped when Grandma picked her up.
Well, of course it did. Grandma picked her up.
Yes.
I have a question. Okay, so my 6-year-old son knows how to manipulate very well, and when he goes to grandma's or aunties, he gets away with a lot more stuff. I don't know how to, and there's expectations, and you're supposed to follow them, but you go over there and you can manipulate that. Like, how do you address that? Because they think that we're being too hard on him, and I'm like, no, he needs to follow this because he does a lot of manipulative things. I mean, I don't know.
Again, it sounds like a conversation that has to happen between the caregivers. It's going to be much more difficult for him to manipulate if you and it was grandma, right?
Yeah,
Are
his house.
talking to each other all the time.
Yeah.
That we're talking and we're texting, and this is what would happen at our house, and this is what we need to happen at your house. Those kinds of conversations. Yes.
Mental intimidation. Any kind of discipline you give them, they think they can get away with it. They think they're practically bulletproof.
So the question was about mental intimidation, and any consequence you give, they think they can get away with it.
Exactly. They think they can just run you over.
So tell me a little bit more about what that might look like. How old is the child we're talking about?
3.
Okay.
There's times that I tell him to sit down, and he continues to stand up. There's times that I try and swat him on the butt, and he still stands up. There's times that we're at restaurants and we tell him to turn around and sit down, and he partially sits down. And we continue to tell him to sit down, and he still doesn't listen.
Okay. That seems like a pretty good, at least the restaurant one, actually all of them, because it's repeated non-compliance, seem like a great opportunity for timeout. And if it's a battle of wills, I believe, I've never met you before, but I bet you can win it with a 3-year-old. Right?
Right.
I mean, you put him into timeout, and he keeps coming out and keeps coming out and keeps coming out, and you gently hold them in timeout, and they yell and scream and tell you what a mean person you are, and you don't say a word. That you're perfectly stoic, that you're, I don't know, like a statue or a robot or something that doesn't talk, and you're just there with them in the timeout, and that they yell and scream and fight for however long, and they tire themselves out, and they're eventually quiet. All right, timeout's over. You were in timeout because you weren't listening. Or the restaurant works just fine too, because for a 3-year-old, they probably got a high chair you can put them in, or you can go out to the car and do timeout there. Though it sounds like kind of as extreme a situation as you're describing, I would get timeout working at home before you take it on the road. Okay. Anything else? If you have questions or concerns or things that seem like you need more help with, I think just give me a call. And take care.